Welcome on into the Third Down Analysis podcast. Thanks, Alex, for joining. How you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, glad to have you back. So we're going to talk about BYU and then Big 12 and then a little bit of Big 12, BYU, SEC, Big 10. So let's just jump into BYU real quick. I want to talk about our hot takes and how they're faring, because you and me and Spencer actually back in like June or July, we had a round of hot takes, and some of them are actually faring really well. Some of them not so great. I will say for me, I had been projecting BYU to go 4-8. It wasn't necessarily a hot take, but maybe the mild part of that hot take was that I didn't think BYU had to go to a bowl game to be successful this year. I thought that if they could just slim down that point differential, they had it was the second worst point differential, or the third or fourth worst point differential in the conference last year. It was a negative 81 point differential. I thought if they could get that down to 0 or close to, I thought, hey, that'd be, even if they go 4-8, that'd be a success. And I thought that they were going to struggle this year. Clearly, they have not. So I clearly missed. And we'll talk a little bit about how BYU's doing, what they're doing. But anyway, so that was one of my hot takes, and I am not ashamed to admit that I was pretty off on that one.
Yeah, well, you're not alone in being off on a hot take. I got on this podcast and said that BYU wouldn't make a bowl game until 2027, I believe. We're about, hopefully, 5 days away from making that wrong completely. So yeah, I completely missed the boat. I did not see this coming.
And then Spencer had one about the top. We're speaking for him now, but a top 30 defense. And I'll tell you, I was looking at this week. So every Monday I refresh my set of metrics that I go through. And BYU, when I was looking at it on Monday, if I remember, they were ranked 20th in points allowed per game. They're down to 15 points per game. Last year they were at 29, almost 30 points per game. So they're allowing 2 fewer touchdowns per game. And after 5 games, you have to think this is actually real, because I know that strength of schedule is always relative in college football, and we're never going to have a true barometer of quality of opponents. I mean, we have a general one, right? Like Alabama's better than Toledo generally, but 5 weeks in, I know that everyone. I mean, this is not a hot take. The BYU's defense is legit, but I did not think BYU was going to jump that big from their defensive side.
No, I didn't see it either. Although one of the hot takes I had is that Jay Hill is the best coach on the coaching staff. I still believe that to be true, although Kalani's done a good job this year. But yeah, it seems real. And I say we, I'm not on the team, but BYU is exceeding everyone's expectations except maybe Spencer's on the defensive side. They've got really good playmakers across the board that are playing to their strengths, and I think that has to be Jay Hill, a lot of it, putting them in good positions, knowing their strengths and finding ways to make them successful. Even in the Baylor game, for example, the way they were playing defense in the first half, they got away from that, and it kind of started to slip. And then you could see the adjustments being made by Jay Hill and the team, and the coaches, that ultimately led them to bend just enough and not break to hold on to that game. But I really think that the talent is playing to its potential because of good coaching, even though they played really great teams.
Yeah, your last point there is spot on. Well, the whole thing that you said is spot on, but where I missed, and this is starting to blend now into how BYU is doing what they're doing this year. So if if we take a step back and we think, where did everyone have BYU this year? We know all the national analysts and pundits in Vegas had BYU at 4 or 5 wins. Most BYU enthusiasts had BYU 7 wins. Felt like it was asking for your cake and being able to eat it too. 8 and 9 wins was like, super nachos from Beto's. So it just was. It was asking for a lot. So I think everyone, both inside and outside of BYU fandom, missed it. So I'd love to get your thoughts on just kind of taking a step back on how BYU is doing what they're doing. But I think you already hit on one of them, though. It's got to be the coaching, because this is the same group of guys that came back, and that's where I thought, all right, the same group of guys. They struggled last year, so you roll out the same group of guys. How often do we see that they take the next step? And I think what I missed on was, in college, development is a real thing. I think the NBA, the NFL, sometimes development it's harder to see. It still happens. Anyways, love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, and honestly, that's one of the things I'm interested to see in the second half of the season, is how much of BYU's success is the fact that it's the same group of guys playing against teams that have had a lot of turnover. One of the things we'll talk about later in the pod is essentially the free agency that exists now in college football. I think BYU can take advantage of that in some pretty unique ways, and I think one of the unexpected ways that I didn't see it playing out this season for BYU is that continuity, that they came into the season knowing who they were playing with and knowing the schemes, knowing what they wanted to do. And I'm interested to see if the second half of the season, now that other teams have had a little bit more time to gel, if that's an advantage that we've been kind of working with as a team that now is not going to exist in the second half quite as much as it did.
Yeah, so that's another good point. Is the continuity? They talked a lot about how, like, if you listen to A-Rod in his practice press conferences or whatever you call that, right, when they do the practice stuff, he's talked a lot about how they had a lot of new guys last year. And now they've got a lot of guys that are, and they're all back this year, right? And now they know what they're doing. And you look at like Caleb Etienne, he did move positions, but last year I couldn't see any positive comments from fans about him. And this year I don't see any comments about him, which must mean he's doing a really good job. Because if an offensive line doesn't get, if no one talks about the offensive line, that means they're doing a good job. And there's really not many comments about the offensive line, because generally I think they still have room for improvement in the run game, I think. But generally they're doing much better than they were last year. So, but I like that free agent. Yeah, we'll jump to that free agency point. So another question I have, this is related to your hot take about Jay Hill, is okay, so we'll talk here in a minute about BYU ceiling, but what do you do to keep Jay Hill around? Because I'm sure that he's already got people who are either reaching out to his agent. I don't know the rules in college football about when people, right? Like NBA, you can. There's times when it's not. I mean, they're always tampering. Well, there's not. You're always talking to people in the NBA. It's just sometimes they call it tampering, sometimes they don't. But you're always negotiating your contracts. I don't know what the timeline is like that for college football, but I'd be shocked if either his representative hasn't already had inquiries, or if there aren't schools like, I don't know, Baylor, who, if they're thinking, all right, if we do fire a Dave Aranda, or some of like I don't know, I'm trying to think of a school in the Big Ten or the SEC, the SEC who's not doing super well, like the ACC, for instance. I don't know. Like, I mean, Florida State just signed their guy for like 10 years for the rest of the century. So, but in general, people are got to be circling him and saying, yeah, we got to bring him in. So what do you do to keep him?
You throw the bag at him. I mean, honestly, you've got to pony up and pay him, and money itself is not the thing. You've got to make sure. I mean, I don't know what Jay Hill's aspirations are. He obviously was the head coach at Weber. Does he want to be a head coach again? Probably. Most guys are wired that way. But I think you can lean on a couple things. Obviously, money. If you can throw more money at him, that's never going to hurt. The other thing is Kalani's probably a great guy to work with and work for. Like, I would love to work for a guy like Kalani who cares that much and I think is genuinely that good of a person. And so, at some point, you can't keep Jay Hill forever as the defensive coordinator.
Yeah.
But my hope would be that you could talk to him about his career plans and say, hey, listen, if we can keep this thing going for a few years, your potential landing spots are not, a middling P5 school. It's not a low-end Big 12 or even a low-end Big 10 or ACC school. Instead, like, if we keep this going, you actually can shoot a little bit higher, and in the long run, it's going to be better for you. So hopefully he can buy into that and see where the program's going. And some of it's just luck, honestly.
That's a really good point. Yeah, I'm also thinking like West Virginia in a couple of years. Maybe even at the end of this. Well, they're doing decent this year now. I mean, they started off a little rough, but like there could be one or two programs in the next few years in the Big 12 that open up, and now they're getting to see him, and so I'm sure that he's raising some eyebrows for some people. I'm going to give you a hard question, and this kind of be one of the last ones on him, but. What if he says, I want to be a head coach like next year? Do you say, if you're Tom Homo, do you say, all right, thank you for your services here? Or do you this is not going to happen. Like, to be clear, this would not happen, but would you find a way to move Kalani out and put Jay Hill in?
I mean, if BYU wins the Big 12, I think that's a tough sell, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, I think it's worth a conversation with Kalani, and hopefully Tom Holm was having those conversations anyway, saying, hey, what is your plan? Like, do you want to keep coaching for 20 years, or is Kalani the kind of guy that has made enough money and he's good to walk away in 3 to 5 years when he's still relatively young and he's still got more money than he knows what to do with? If that's the case, then maybe you try and set something up like they have up at the U on the Hill, where Morgan Scalley is the heir apparent. Everyone knows it. No one knows exactly when Kyle Whittingham's going to retire, but it's probably in the next year or two. And Morgan Scalley has built something there that he knows he's going to walk into a better situation than any job he could chase anywhere else. And so I think it all kind of does depend on Kalani and what he wants to do. And ultimately, Jay Hill's got to be on board. But hopefully those conversations are happening so that you don't let a great, coach walk out the door without trying to keep him.
That's a really good point. What you're saying, by the way, you said something in there that I thought, boy, that's really applicable, not just in college football at BYU, and if, for the 7 people in Malaysia that are listening to this, if there's actually more people, but if you're a manager out there and you have someone who's really talented and you could see them pretty quickly outgrowing their role, then one, is there any way that you can create, if there's a clear path within the team, then certainly have those conversations now. If there's not, is there a way you can create something within your team? And then the third option is, if not, can you find a place for them in the org? Anyways, so that's...
Yeah, and ultimately, I mean, that's where Kalani is the best asset to keeping Jay Hill, because I think people can be patient in a situation where they want to grow if they feel like they like going to work and they like their boss and they like what they're doing. Hopefully that checks all the boxes. And then if you can pay him extra money, that kind of solves a lot of those problems.
And if you can give him a hill right next to Y, I know it's called Y Mountain, but Y Hill, if you can give him a hill with a J on it, and then you call that J Hill,
Oh, you were waiting. You were holding on to that one.
I was holding on to that one. By the way, that's the pun drop for the episode there. Okay, last question about BYU. What do you think their ceiling is for this year?
I mean, and this kind of goes into our next topic, which is the Big 12, but I don't know why the ceiling can't be the playoff.
Yeah.
Now, I am a lifelong BYU fan. I've been on this roller coaster before. So to be clear, I'm not projecting that they are going to the playoff, but there's a path, and there's a path more than I thought before. So ultimately, I think they've got a tough stretch coming up. Arizona is really good. I know the record is 3-2. I've watched their games. That offense scares me, and I'm interested to see how BYU's defense stacks up against them. But if they can get through the next few games unscathed, I mean, they've got a real shot. Health is going to play a big part into it. So, but yeah, I mean, ceiling is winning the Big 12 and going to the playoff, or being an at-large team if they lose one or two. How real is that? I don't know, but honestly, BYU's the only team in the country with 2 top 25 wins as of today.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know what that means. Maybe it's just a fun stat, but they're good, right? And you look at who they've played. I mean, when they beat SMU, it was an ugly game, and I was, like I think many people, a bit disappointed with the performance, because in my mind, SMU is this middling to low-end ACC team. That's not the case. Their offense is for real. They are really good, SMU, and BYU didn't allow a touchdown in that game. So at some point, like, this is real, and it's super fun.
Yeah. Okay, I'm glad you said that. At some point, this is real, and I keep seeing on social, after each game, I keep seeing people on social media say, "Okay, is BYU good?" And it's fans wanting to drink the Kool-Aid, being a little bit afraid to do it because of past years. I mean, I was messaging some friends, and I remembered the TCU loss in 2009, I think it was, when game day came to Provo. TCU was number 4, I think BYU was number 8, and that was like the Kansas State game, but BYU was on the receiving end of that one, where they could not get a first down for the life of them. And that TCU team, I still remember, looked so much more athletic than BYU. They looked ready for the Big 12 at that point. So, I agree with you, though, as far as the ceiling. Right now, I'm not setting my expectations, because I think my expectations, I said 4-8 at the beginning of the year. And so what I'm trying to do is keep those expectations there, so that everything that BYU does from here on out is just gravy. It's like, this is awesome. But
yeah.
I
think realistically they probably end with 3 losses.
Yeah, that's where I'm at. 2 to 3 losses. I think there's 2 losses between now and Utah. And I would have originally said I was pretty set on Utah and UCF. And I was unsure about Oklahoma State and Arizona originally. I thought it was going to be a loss, but I think BYU is going to take care of Arizona. I think it's going to be a close game, but I think they're going to win. And Oklahoma State is all sorts of out of whack. Their defense is one of the worst defenses in the conference. Like, they're giving up. So they gave up the most amount of explosive plays last year in the conference, and they're not doing any better this year. They're giving up, like, it's over 400 yards a game. their defense has been bad for the last 2 years, but the thing is that last year their offense was actually really good, and now this year their offense is not good, and so it's not covering up the sins of their defense. And so I mean, that game, when I say I'm not worried about that game, I mean I do think it's very reasonable to have BYU as the favorite and to expect them to win. But right now I'm kind of settling in it. I think two losses is like a really optimistic. Yeah, I think that's really doable. 3 losses is probably the most realistic for me.
Yeah, I would agree. And ultimately, I mean, some of this depends on health of BYU and health of the other teams as well, right?
Yeah.
If Isaac Wilson is still playing quarterback for the U when BYU plays them, I like BYU's odds a lot more than if Cam Rising's playing, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, like all those teams you mentioned, and this I think is the story of the Big 12. We can get to week 11 or week 10 for all of these teams and legitimately ask the question, are they good? And I'm not sure what the answer is, right? I mean, you go down the board, like UCF, are they good? I don't know.
Yeah.
If you look at their wins and losses, I'm not sure they're good. You look at Oklahoma State, for sure. Are they good? I don't know. Utah, are they good? I don't know, because I thought they were good, but then they barely got out of Stillwater with a win. They got crushed by Arizona. And then Arizona last week got beat by Texas Tech, who, if you look at their schedule, I'm not sure they're good. And so at some point, like all of these teams I think all these teams are just fine. Like, I'm not sure there's a super great team in the league, and I'm not sure, well, there are some really bad teams, but ultimately anyone can beat anyone on any given week, which is why I think 3 wins or 3 losses for BYU makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a number of iterations of this in which BYU doesn't lose 3 games because they just get, they get lucky on the health and the way the ball bounces, and frankly, their defense travels well, and they are playing really well. And they're not a penalized team. They're in the top 20 of least amount of penalties in the country.
Oh, wow.
Which is something I never thought you'd be able to say about BYU. Their special teams are playing fantastic. Kelly Papinga has that unit playing really, really well. And ultimately, if Jake Retzlaff can just not screw it up, BYU will be in every game. Yeah. Will they win every game? No, I don't think so. Will they beat Oklahoma State, Utah? I sure hope so, but I don't know. Especially at Utah, that's going to be a tough game, but they're going to be in every game. I think that's something I didn't think we could say at the beginning of the year.
Yeah, I love the point. So I love everything you said. It's a really good point that we could get to week 10 with the Big 10 or with the Big 12, and we could be saying, are they really good? And I that's what makes the league having so much parity without having a true alpha, at which you can always point and say, okay, you can anchor off of that team, like Alabama in the SEC, and you just measure everything against Alabama and Georgia. I do think Iowa State seems to be playing like the best team right now,
for sure.
And then I think I honestly think it's a BYU, Utah, Kansas State as like the next tier. They're still kind of in the same. I think they're all in the same tier, but I think Iowa State might be one step ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. Although, they've looked good, but I don't know that they've looked that much better than BYU.
Well, that's true. I mean, that's fair.
Now, point differential, they're better. Their defense is better, which again, we've just praised Jay Hill in the defense. So that is saying something, and that is what I think makes Iowa State different, is that they do have a defense every bit as good as BYU's.
Yeah.
and their offense is looking good too. So I would agree. Like right now, they're playing at that level. Would it also shock you if we got on this podcast 4 weeks from now and they had lost 3 games by now? No.
Right. Because they've got that road trip to Salt Lake City towards the end of the season, and then they do have Kansas State, which I want to say is in Manhattan.
I believe so.
At the last week of the season for Farmageddon, which is one of the better rivalry names that I've heard of.
Yeah, it really is.
I'd like to see, like, if every rivalry game could have a mascot. I'd love to see what the Farmageddon mascot would look like, or you know how some of them have
like the trophy, the
wagon
trophy wheel, or the
I'm sure I could just Google this and find this out, but is there a Farmageddon trophy, or like what are they? Is it the sickle? Is it the tractor? Well, that actually sounds.
It probably is a big golden sickle.
Yeah. Oh, a big golden. Well, I guess Iowa and Iowa State is the Cyhawk trophy, or the Cyhawk something. Maybe that's just the Cyhawk rivalry. Anyways, that would be a fun additional episode another day. Just go through rivalries. Okay, so you hit on some of the things with the Big 12. Anything else you want to hit on with the Big 12?
No, I mean I'm. It's a fun league, man. It really is. Like, not having a true blue blood, I think, hurts them in the long run when it comes to trying to get into the playoffs potentially.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, like, these are fun games across the board. I have loved just turning it on and watching 2 random teams play because I think that parity is really interesting and really fun. And my hope is, and this can maybe lead into our next conversation, but my hope is that 2 or 3 teams can kind of separate themselves from the pack, right?
Yeah.
And not be the Pac-12 of old where they just beat each other up and ultimately there's no one left standing. Like, I really would love to see an Iowa State, a BYU, and a Kansas State, or, you know, heaven forbid, a Utah being in that top 3 that kind of separates themselves and potentially then allows them to maybe get multiple bids into the playoff.
Okay. Yeah. The one comment, and then let's hit where I know you wanted to go to Big 12, SEC, Big 10. But one comment on that real quick. Utah really, I think they really needed to go undefeated. Well, okay, let me take it back. I think Utah has it because of the brand. Like, it just, you have to admit, because of brand, if they go undefeated, even if they lost in the Big 12 title, I think they have a shot at an at-large bid. A shot. I think that's an outside shot, to be clear. But if BYU goes undefeated, if Iowa State, let's say they lose to Kansas State, but I guess that would take them out of the. I was just trying to think of a scenario where Kansas State effectively goes almost undefeated the rest of the way, and maybe they lose one game. Like, BYU needs Kansas State to almost win out so that win looks better and better and better. But I think there's a scenario where if BYU goes in undefeated and Iowa State goes in undefeated, I think there's a real scenario where both of them could get into the CFP, so long as the SEC and a little bit of the Big Ten continue to beat up on each other, because now you've got, like, well, anyways, let's just jump into what you were gonna. Let's go to where you wanted to go with that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's definitely a world in which the Big 12 can get 2. I don't think 3 is probably likely, but I think 2 makes sense, especially if you've got a undefeated champion and a 1-loss or potentially 2-loss second place team. I think you probably get 2 in. I think Utah, to your point, and Kansas State to some degree have enough brand awareness that if BYU and Utah have the same record at the end of the day and they're both being in consideration for the playoff, Utah's going to go.
Yeah.
Same thing with Kansas State. I think BYU would have to have a better record than both of those teams to be in the conversation, unless they win, right? And even if they win with 2 losses, then they're in. And I think at that point in time, it can all shake out. I think, my big thing about the SEC and Big Ten is what, kind of we were talking about earlier, we chatted about. As much fun as it is to watch the Big 12, and I've loved every minute of it, and the ACC is really fun as well, actually, this year. If you watch that Alabama-Georgia game from 2 weeks ago, that's a different sport.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Ultimately, the level of competition in the SEC, I'd say less so in the Big Ten this year, but it's still there. I mean, this week with Ohio State and Oregon, it's going to be a really fun game to watch, and it's going to be high-level football. At some point, it feels a lot like what BYU fans and the P5 fans used to feel between the Power Five and everyone else, which is I think the champion from the Big 12 or the ACC could play with them. But if you played 10 times, they're probably going to lose 8.
Yeah, I agree with you there.
Right? At some point, it's a depth game in that, your starters maybe can play with the other guys' starters, but it's the bench guys, and it's the second units that, their second units would start over a lot of these Big 12 teams and ACC team starters, which is the difference. And so that's where I don't know. The playoff this year is going to be really interesting to see how the Big 12 and the ACC stack up against the SEC and the Big 10, because on any given Saturday, you can win. Look at what's happening. Anybody can beat anybody. But I would be very surprised after watching the quality of the SEC and the Big 10 to some degree if it's not the Final Four. I'd be surprised if anyone but those 2 conferences had a team in the Final Four.
I think you're right. And as a BYU Big 12 fan, it's a little bit of a hesitant but acknowledgement. Yes, reluctance. And at the same time, when I step back and I'm a college football fan, I always loved watching, from years, I loved watching I guess in Utah, it's a 1:30 kick. Here in Central Time, it's a 2:30 kick. But the 2:30, that second window CBS game, SEC, I've loved for years watching Vern Lundquist. And I always forget his name's Gary Danielson, but he's one of my favorite color commentators. He teaches the game so well. I think you're right. I'd be shocked. I'd be pleasantly surprised if it's not SEC Big Ten in the Final Four. But I do have, this is going to be my hot take, is I think that over the next 2 to 3 years, I think the playoff is going to have more of the I think the ACC and the Big 12 is going to be able to make a little bit more noise than we think, and some of the lower tier SEC Big 10 teams I think are going to make more noise. And the reason why I think is I actually think that generally across the board there's a little bit more parity in college football because of the transfer portal. NIL enables any team to go out and get one player, and now you've got free agency every year, whereas before Georgia, Alabamas of the world could stack that talent year after year, and those players couldn't move. Now they're moving. Those teams are still reloading with Alabama's Ryan Williams made this incredible catch against, several incredible catches against Georgia and Vandy, but so they're still reloading, but they're reloading with younger guys typically. And I will say, granted, they are also loading up with the Big 12's best players who are now moving up the ranks.
Okay, so you stole my hot take as well, actually. My big hot take is that NIL, transfer portal, essentially free agency, is the best thing that has happened to college football from a parity standpoint in a long time, maybe ever. If you think about, if you're a 5-star kid who wants to go and be a star, right? And you sign on to play at Alabama or Tennessee or Michigan, Ohio State, and suddenly you are now on the roster with a whole bench of guys that are 5 stars. And you have to wait your turn. You're on the bench. You're not getting the playing time you want, and you're probably not being the star that you think you should be. What are you going to do? Are you going to wait it out for 3 years? Arch Manning style? Like he's pretty unique, right? That he's okay to take a seat and wait. Or are you going to say, you know what? I know I can play at Alabama. I know I can play at Ohio State because I'm here. But I might rather go to one of these really interesting Big 12 teams or really interesting ACC team where I know I'm going to start because talent-wise, I'm the top dog. I am a big fish in a little pond. And because the playoff has expanded, I am still going to get the national exposure that I could otherwise. But instead of being one of many at Alabama, I'm suddenly going to be at Colorado, like Shadur Sanders or Travis Hunter, and they're getting just as much pub as anybody in the country. You look at the running back for Boise State. You look at quarterback at Kansas State. You look at, across the board. You look at the quarterback at Miami. Like all of these guys are not playing in the ACC or in the SEC or the Big Ten, but they're still getting a lot of pub. They're still in the conversation. And I think that a lot more people are going to look at that and say, hey, my goal of getting to the NFL, my goal of making a lot of money in the NIL, and my goal of essentially being a star is just as likely to happen at a different school. And I can get there maybe quicker versus sitting on the bench here at LSU or at Alabama or at Michigan. And yeah, I might win a championship. I'm going to be part of something great, but I'm not going to be leading it. So why don't I jump, right? And so ultimately, I think the expanded playoff and the movement is bad news for the SEC and the Big Ten in the long run from a depth standpoint. Yes, they're still going to be at the top. They're always going to be at the top. And I'm definitely not saying that they're going to fall off their perch. What I am saying is that competent programs in the Big 12 and in the ACC, and to some degree in maybe the G5 as well, are going to be able to compete. Maybe not every year, but they will be able to put together runs to fight for playoff position and, frankly, winning games in the playoff in a way that historically has never happened when it was a 4-team playoff or a 2-team bowl game. And even this year, I'm not sure it's going to happen, but I do see a roadmap for success for some of these schools, including BYU, which we can get to in a minute. But any thoughts on that?
You expressed that really well. I'm glad you said that because I've been thinking about the playoff and I've been thinking about the common sentiment that I hear from most fans and even a lot of analysts. And we all have the assumption that it's going to be Texas, Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, or some combination of name 4 of the high brand schools that are in those two conferences. And kind of the assumption is that those are going to usually be the Final Four every year. And I bet that 2 of the spots, maybe 3 of the spots are in the Final Four, but TCU beat Michigan 2 years ago in the Final Four to get to the finals. And I know that they got bushwhacked, but you said it, on any given Saturday, a team can win. I've always felt like BYU's ones could compete with 85 to 90% of the country. But the problem is that like most teams, you never have 100% of your ones, and you can't run your ones all game. And so that's where they were always going to struggle in that sense against the top tiers. But I think you're right. I think that we're going to see a team, a 7 seed, a 6 seed, some of these teams make a run, and I don't think it's always going to come from. I don't think we're going to end up with Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, Oregon, Texas, whatever, every year in the Final Four. I think we're going to see a couple of teams that are a little bit on the quote unquote fringe do. So I actually agree. I've been thinking about that, and I agree with you.
Well, and you know who else agrees with me? The commissioners of the SEC and the Big Ten. They are pushing right now. I don't know if you saw this, but they're pushing to have a guaranteed 3 slots for both of those conferences in the playoff. Now, why would they need that? Mm-hmm. Well, this year they don't need that because, frankly, both of them are probably going to get 3 in. For sure the SEC, probably the Big Ten as well. But I think the reason they're wanting that is because they're looking at the landscape and saying, okay, there's a lot of parity. If you watch week 6 of college football this week, you know that anyone can beat anyone. Mm-hmm. If Alabama can go into Vanderbilt and lose for the first time ever, then something's changing. Now, it's not going to change overnight, but they want to lock in their power. And frankly, they might get it because they have the power to do that right now. But ultimately, I think they are seeing that in this new landscape, they've got to be really smart about how they take care of their talent. And ultimately, other schools, if they have enough money, enough booster money, and if they're a well-run program, they can do some damage. And ultimately, I think that leads me to my biggest hot take for BYU.
Oh, yeah.
Which is, I think the second half of this season is quite possibly the most important half a season of football in BYU history. If you think about look at BYU basketball, right? Kevin Young came in, he set a vision for where BYU could go and what he wanted that program to be, and what happened? The boosters lined up to pay whoever, anyone and everyone, to come play. BYU is now in the conversation in basketball for top 20 guys, multiple top 20 guys, probably 4 guys they're in serious contention for to sign, including the number 1 overall prospect who's going to be in Provo this weekend, by the way, at this Arizona game. But they're in contention because the boosters are lining up and willing to pay for it. That hasn't happened yet for BYU football to the same degree. And what I'm saying is Kalani is not going to come in and have the credentials that Kevin Young had. But what he can do is have a program whose culture is fantastic, that people love playing there. They feel good. They feel respected. You and I have both been at BYU. It's a great place to be. And ultimately, if you can start winning at a high enough level and then selling your boosters on that vision, the boosters are going to line up. There's plenty of money for BYU fans to pay both BYU basketball and BYU football. So what does that then mean? If BYU can win, if they can go 10-2 this year and only lose 2 games, maybe only lose 1 game, heaven forbid if they go to the playoff or win the Big 12, suddenly Kalani can go out and say, hey guys, we've got 5 LDS quarterbacks this year coming out of like the top 3 quarterbacks, I think, in college or in high school football are all LDS this year. Maybe not the top 3, but at least like it's somewhere in like the 3 of the top 10 or something. Now, were you going to get them before? Probably not. Are you going to get them now? Maybe not either. But what happens when a guy like Jackson Dart, who grew up in Kaysville, Utah, goes to USC, doesn't have a great experience, then he's looking for somewhere to go? Well, he goes to Ole Miss. What happens if BYU has the culture, the money, and the program in a spot where it's a no-brainer for him to go home and go play at BYU? Well, suddenly then if you upgrade this year's team with Jake Retzlaff to Jackson Dart, and then you do that at a few other positions as well, well, now suddenly it's not a surprise that BYU's in the in contention for the Big 12 in a playoff, they might be the favorite out of the Big 12 to do that. And I think BYU is uniquely situated, if they can capitalize at the end of this year, to turn this one season success into years of success moving forward.
I had not thought about that in that way, but everything you laid out makes a lot of sense. If I think about, I'm going to use a basketball analogy to describe how I'm thinking inside in response to what you just said, is when there's like, if you play against guys who are really good, it's hard to get a shot off. And if you think about guys who transition from college into the NBA, or even guys who can't get to the NBA because they can't create a shot for themselves, so that's one situation. But when you finally get an open, like when you actually are able to get an open shot, like if you're able to create your shot, and then you've got an open shot, then it comes down to, it's a make or miss. Like can you actually make the shot? And it's not the best analogy, but the way that I'm thinking about that, what you're responding to your comment, is that BYU they have an opening. Like, they've never been able to create space for them at the level that they are right now. And now this year, they're actually starting to create space for themselves. And so now that they're creating space, and they're going to actually be able to get a shot out, like the beautiful thing about this year is it's completely within their control to get to the CFP. They've never had this ever before where, hey, win out, and which is incredibly hard. They don't even actually have to win out all the way undefeated, but yeah. Like it is they've never had it in their control as much as it is right now to get to the playoff, where they know there's a guaranteed. So if they can get to the Big 12 title game, then they know that, like, it's not a hope and a prayer that a committee member would find them worthy. They can actually do that. So now the question is, can they actually make the shot? It's the Mark Jackson, it's a make or miss league. Like, can they make it?
Yeah, and ultimately, before the season, I had conversations with people saying, okay, how does BYU football start getting boosters to start backing them? Right? Because right now, they're not doing it to the same level that we're seeing for BYU basketball. And a lot of the answers were, well, maybe Kalani's not the guy, and you got to bring in somebody with NFL pedigree and a connection to BYU or to the church that says, okay, is that Kellen Moore coming back? Is it, Andy Reid? It's not going to happen. But, how are you going to do that? Because ultimately, that's what happened with BYU basketball, is you just got the right guy to come in and create the energy. Well, that wasn't going to happen with BYU football in the same way. But what none of us saw was a path to create that energy on the field. It's amazing, and I didn't think we'd be here. And to be clear, I would not bet any amount of money that BYU is going to go to the playoff, or frankly even win the Big 12. But I don't think they have to get the excitement up. I was in LaVell Edwards Stadium against Kansas State. I've never heard the stadium that loud. I'm going to be there in 3 days or 4 days against Arizona. I'm extremely excited because it will be rocking. And honestly, that's what you need to get people excited. And the fact that we have that chance by our play on the field is fantastic. But it can go the other way just as fast. If BYU loses 6 games here on out, everyone's just going to say, I'll just give my money to Kevin Young.
Yeah.
Which is why I say it's the most important half season of football in program history.
You've teed it up really well. I guess the other analogy that comes to my head is, if you're a football player trying to make an NFL team, I think about what was it, the Kurt Warner story. I watched the American Underdog video, and I'm sure it's pretty accurate. It's probably not 100% accurate, but there's the scene where he goes to Green Bay, and I forget who the coach was, but he tells him, hey, okay, all right, Kurt, go in and run the offense. And Kurt's hesitant because he wasn't ready for the moment, and he said he hesitated, and the coach had no time for that, and it's like, okay, all right, great, that's fine, and comes in and cuts him either that night, and Kurt's trying to say, hold on, I can do it, and the coach basically says, if you could have done it, then you would have done it. And so, just to your point, I hope, this is the hope, it's not my expectation, but my hope is that that locker room and Kalani know something or believe in something that I think the fan base is just starting to get an inkling of, and that they're able to capitalize on the moment. Because I think that this is a perfect weekend to kick off everything that you just said for this second half, where big noon is coming. I'll be really curious to see where they set up the pregame, and I know they'll probably be on the field for part of the game, but I mean, this is a perfect way to kick that off. And I think that there's a really good situation. There's a really good chance that BYU goes into Salt Lake City undefeated, and Utah's at that point, I guess they would be 7-1. BYU would be 8-0, and having the rivalry game early November in that situation actually puts a spotlight on those two teams and in the Big 12 in a way that it would not have been on them if it was November 30th, Thanksgiving weekend, which is going to have it's going to be a bummer that it's not at the end because of the nostalgia and just all the feelings that way. But I think that it could, there's a path where that could play out to be a pretty big spotlight on that game. But man, you phrased that up really well. So my BYU hot take, which, I guess hot takes you're supposed to believe, although I think about half of, I think there are certain national TV pundits who have made a career out of hot takes that I don't think they've ever believed. But I think BYU is going to get to the Big 12 title game either this year or next year, and I think they're going to win it, which is so much faster than I thought. Because, and I think they've got potentially a better chance to do it next year, because you still have, you've got Jake Retzloff should likely be back. A good chunk of the receivers and the skill positions on offense should be back. The offensive line and the defensive lines, I have a little bit of question about the turnover there. I think there is some real question there, but they've been playing some young guys on the defensive line, and that's where they've really recruited a lot of guys. So you think maybe they'll see something there. Linebacking core is still, for the bulk of it, still pretty young. The secondary, they'll lose a couple key players, but like they've shown now 2 years in a row that they can plug guys in, and they've got a lot of young guys playing. So I mean, there is a scenario where where like 75% of this team comes back, and guys step up, guys develop, and we run it back. But I don't know. We'll see.
Hey, so that's pretty big departure from my hot take. Just 2 months ago of BYU not making a bowl game for 3 years. And to be clear, I couldn't be more thrilled.
Yes, I agree. It's a pretty big departure, and I'm still not going to adjust my expectations. I'm gonna remind myself every game I thought BYU was going to go 4-8, because if, as a fan, if you want to be happy, do your very best to align your expectations with reality, which kind of means you have to know the future, but it just means you need to really check yourself. And then you don't have as much disappointment. Like if you thought BYU was going to be 10-2, you were probably crazy, like legitimately crazy. But if you said, hey, I thought BYU was going to be 6-6, and you hold that expectation, it's like budget season. You don't change your budget mid-year. You keep the budget, and you just happen to beat the budget really well, and you get a really big bonus. Like that's just,
yeah. And to be clear, I also, yeah, I mean, after the Kansas State game, my wife and I were walking back to the car. I'm on cloud nine, right? And just saying, oh man, this is great. Like, what are the possibilities? And she said, just be careful. Like, you do this every year. You get your hopes up and then they crash. And I say, yeah, you're right. So I'm doing that same exercise every year. I've got a friend, Kelby Jones, who freshman year, we were watching the BYU UCLA game together when I think UCLA kicked like a 55-yarder to beat BYU. And it was at that point in time that we both looked at each other and said, every year BYU breaks your heart. And so from then on out, every year on the heartbreaking losses, we send each other a text that says, okay, this was the year. I have yet to get that text from Kelby, and I hope I don't get it.
I hope you don't either. I hope you don't either. I'm glad you got to go to the Kansas State game. I'm glad you're going to the Arizona game. And what's funny about you saying your wife was reminding you this last game against Baylor, the very therapeutic first quarter where I literally texted my brothers-in-law. I don't know how you say that, but I have multiple brothers-in-law. Anyways, texted them and I said something like, this is therapeutic because that interception where it bounces off of Mangelson's hand and Batty, or Nelson's hand, and Mangelson catches it. Like, those were the plays that BYU was suffering all last year. And for it to bounce this way, I said to my wife, Mary, this is very therapeutic. And I was so ecstatic. I said, I thought BYU was going to win this game by 3. I think they're going to blow Baylor out. And she immediately says, I have a bad feeling. Like, don't say that. Like, I have a bad feeling about that. And sure enough, I'm sweating bullets at the end of the game. It's just like, oh man. So, well, Alex, thanks for coming on. We're going to do this again. We'll see in 4 weeks. Who knows? We may not do this again because in 4 weeks it could be so bad, or we could be doing this right before the Utah game, and we could be saying, "Wow, we're seeing what we said," or maybe it's somewhere. It's more likely to be somewhere in the middle. It's more likely, like, all right, BYU 6-2, 7-1. They got a shot at the Big 12 title game. A tough game against Utah. We'll see. So,
hey, I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for having me. Excited to talk again whenever we do. And before I go, I just want to give a shout out. You've got a listener, Dominic Bonanno, who's listened a lot. Go Tigers, Dominic. Michigan's not doing it for you, but I'm pulling for the Tigers this year.
Is that Mizzou or LSU?
The Detroit Tigers.
Oh, the Detroit.
MLB.
Oh, okay. Yeah, they play in a little bit of a different league.
Yep, they do.
Okay, excellent. All right. Well, thanks for listening, Dominic. Okay, thanks, Alex.